Good morning, everybody. You know, we were joking in the green room that it's really every philanthropist's nightmare to follow Judy Rodin. You've just witnessed why. She is one of the most brilliant thinkers our field has had for a very long time, and as you could see, a pioneer in the art and the science of building resilient cities. What I didn't realize is that my structure of 5 lessons of resilience would bear an uncanny resemblance to Judy's. So in the spirit of repetition and reinforcement being the sincerest form of respect, please forgive me for some of that. But I do want to offer these lessons from a slightly different perspective. Stated simply, side by side with the lessons that Judy noted from the profoundly important, impressive collective effort emerging from New York, there are equally impressive and innovative lessons for building resilience from places we least expect. Cities like New Orleans and Detroit, cities that by virtue of their multifaceted adverse realities are constructing resilience frameworks that encompass not just environmental sustainability, but also economic vitality, social cohesion, and equity and inclusion in a full spectrum conception of resilience. You know, it's not that these dimensions of resilience aren't at play here in New York, because absolutely they are. But unexpected places cast these considerations in bright relief. I want to mention 5 lessons that are emerging. And there'll be a test at the end. If you can put Judy's next to mine, you get to listen to the next panel. So lesson 1, building resilience requires viewing the present and the future concurrently. Some of you may recall in Madeleine L'Engle's classic children's book, A Wrinkle in Time, a device called a tesseract that allows the characters to travel through time. We may accept that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but if we think a bit outside the box or outside the space-time continuum, you can actually bend that line back on itself, bringing the 2 points together, collapsing the present and the future. It's not a bad metaphor for a perspective we so desperately need as we think about resilience. Politically, technically, emotionally, it's an unnatural act for us to behave in the here and now in ways that take their bearings from a distant horizon. And the current Washington environment is certainly a painful reminder of that. But climate change in America has set in motion forces that will ever change the nature of life in our cities. It's a tesseract moment for municipal leadership. We have to summon the creativity and the vision to act in a way that does dual duty, simultaneously ameliorating current crises and preparing ourselves for the challenges climate change will visit on us in the next 10 to 20 years, to say nothing of the next 50 or 100. In its landmark report released last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assigned global society a carbon budget that we must stay within if we hope to avoid a level of turmoil that would overwhelm even the most sophisticated resilience plans. We have spent half of that budget already, half. And our current rate of emissions puts us on track to hit the ceiling, and that is to say, to have released all the carbon we ever can in 2040. That trajectory has to change. And the only way to do it is to create constructs that live at once in the present and the future. And that's what we in Detroit have tried to do through something called Detroit Future City. It bears some resemblance to the New York City plan as a vision document, as a decision-making framework, and an investment blueprint to reimagine this Rust Belt city. But because of the land use realities of Detroit, with nearly 40 square miles of vacant and abandoned land, that's the size of the city of San Francisco, and because of the socioeconomic circumstances of the city's residents, it's quite a different proposition. The plan offers a syncopation strategy. It's a guide to how we can emphasize the city's strong beats by concentrating investments in nodes of commercial and residential vitality, while attending to the weak beats by reimagining underutilized land to move parcels from the liability side of the ledger to the asset side. The Detroit Free Press wrote, "The framework is more than a plan for stanching the city's infrastructural bleeding. It's a blueprint for how a decaying city can reinvent itself. It's not a patch, it's a revolution." Part of that revolution is a reconceptualization of what the future post-industrial city in America will look like and how it will function. The decisions we make today have to move beyond lifting the city out of a state of extremis toward creating the foundational elements of a city that is stable, vibrant, and sustainable. The plan accordingly contemplates climate resilience. It embraces the opportunity to think now about how the city, which will actually be relatively well positioned in terms of temperature and water access as climate change progresses, how the city can prepare to absorb people displaced by heat, drought, or sea level rise elsewhere. Similarly, the plan proposes short-term investments in blue-green infrastructure, from reforestation to water management, that position public systems for long-term sustainability, greenhouse gas mitigation, and affordability. You know, Kurt Vonnegut suggested in his Armageddon in retrospect, there should have been a Secretary of the Future. In effect, Detroit has that. It's a city bearing watching. Lesson 2, and a variation on Judy's 5th lesson, building resilience requires that we reinvent municipal governance models. People living in New Orleans know the fate of their city is tied not only to the levee systems and the accompanying drainage and pumping systems, but also to the wetlands that line the Gulf Coast. Those wetlands are in turn inextricably interwoven with coastal restoration and land use plans, which in turn exist within a broader system that includes the politics of community engagement in the 9th Ward and every other ward of the city, as well as the surrounding parishes. New Orleans faces a set of interconnected social, economic, ecological, and political systems interacting in unpredictable ways that defy the rigid, narrow, static approaches that serve as society's default settings. As Timon McPherson, who will be speaking later today, has noted, it turns out that you can't understand the behavior of a system by studying its parts. You need to study the whole thing. Some of these parts fall within the city's boundaries, some reach into the county, and others are in control of state and federal agencies. Both built and natural systems are implicated, and the actions of the public and private sectors matter enormously. Conventional governance structures, it goes without saying, don't lend themselves to navigating this kind of terrain. As we craft resilience plans, therefore, we should ask what disciplines, what sources of knowledge, and what geographic scope we need to consider. In a word, what is the sweep of the problem shed, and how will we align systems accordingly? Lesson 3, resilience is not an end state, but an approach. Climate change is not like an infection cured with an injection. It is a chronic disease requiring ongoing care by a team of skilled healers. Building resilience is an ongoing process, not a shift to a new stasis. There is no new normal. In a VUCA world, where things are increasingly volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous, we need a new cadre of professionals who understand the true dimensions of climate change, particularly as they relate to our social and economic fabric, and who are capable of teaching the habits of adaptive management. Far more challenging, though, is the need for an evolution in the mindset of current professionals of all stripes. In effect, most jobs will become climate jobs over the coming years, whether or not people describe them or even conceive of them that way. Each one of us has an obligation to proceed in our personal and our professional lives armed with an awareness of the nature and severity of climate challenge and the disproportionate impact it will have on the most vulnerable. We all need to adopt the habit of asking how our decisions will affect our climate, as well as how climate change will affect the viability of our decisions. And we need to ask whether, when viewed through this climate lens, those decisions are still wise. Lesson 4, building resilience requires that we view local residents as assets with essential knowledge, not as victims to be protected. In her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit describes a curious disparity in the effects of the Chicago heat wave of 1995, which killed almost 700 people. She writes, though Latinos were nearly a quarter of Chicago's population, they represented only 2% of the deaths. African Americans in one poor neighborhood were 10 times as likely to die as Latinos in the equally impoverished adjoining neighborhood. The difference was in the quality of neighborhoods themselves. As Judy noted in her 4th lesson, the evidence is clear that social capital contributes in times of disturbance to more effective dissemination of information, improved mutual support, and reduced mortality. One researcher puts it this way: social capital matters more than such factors as greater economic resources, assistance from the government or outside agencies, or even low levels of damage in facilitating recovery and helping survivors coordinate for more effective reconstruction. As a result, urban resilience hinges on municipalities and community development organizations, including residents, in designing the future of their neighborhoods, on community health organizations providing safe and healthy housing, on human service organizations strengthening the supports families need to get back on their feet following crises, and on arts organizations using cultural activities to contribute to the revitalization of neighborhoods. It also depends on the community centers and churches, synagogues and mosques, even the neighborhood busybody. Viewed from this perspective, local residents come into focus as leaders with distinctive knowledge and critical roles in building resilience, not as passive victims who need to be protected. The fifth lesson, the final lesson: resilience gains will be fleeting and ephemeral if they're not grounded in an ethic of equity and inclusiveness. The impacts of climate change pose the greatest threat for low-income and other vulnerable populations. Jacob Reams, an historian of disaster response, observed, "Disasters are not blind. We have this rhetoric of disasters affecting rich and poor equally, and that's simply not true. Disasters reveal our deepest fault lines of inequality and economic vulnerability. The transition to greater resilience must occur in ways that don't further compound the hardships facing disadvantaged people already at greater risk." By and large, urban, regional, and hazard mitigation planning efforts have not sought the perspectives of low-income residents in the design of resilience measures, nor have they ensured that these residents benefit meaningfully from the implementation of those measures. As a result, the unique knowledge and needs of low-income populations are routinely overlooked in both resilience planning and disaster preparedness. All of us, elected officials, resilience practitioners, philanthropists, need to become more fluent in the interests and needs of low-income communities, and this requires more than just dialogue. Individuals affected by disasters and by the responses to those disasters need to be at the tables where response plans are drawn. Local residents hold knowledge essential to effective responses, and ultimately, they are the ones who will own the work. This is particularly true insofar as resilience will, unfortunately, but inevitably, give rise to winners and losers. In the effects of climate change, to be sure, but also in our efforts to prepare for and recover from those effects. We need to acknowledge that publicly. We also need to ensure that the process that determines the distribution of costs and benefits are transparent and fair. Which neighborhoods will be protected? Which won't? Who decides? We also need to consider how losers should be compensated. Without explicit, careful attention to issues of social and economic justice, we will fail to build the broad-based political will required to make the massive changes and investments in resilience needed in cities everywhere. So we at Kresge believe that climate change and society's response to it will define the future of cities. If we care about cities and the well-being of the people who live in them, we must act today to avoid the unmanageable at the same time we make plans to manage the unavoidable. Resilience measures taken absent dramatic greenhouse gas reductions are a mirage. As one observer has noted, the hallmarks of resilience are redundancy, adaptation, and flexibility, but also the foresight and good judgment to avoid the brawl in the first place. Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and President of Ireland before that, describes climate change as the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. This compels us to ground our work in an ethic of equity and inclusiveness. We need to elevate and celebrate urban leaders who show courage in addressing climate change and building resilience. And given what is at stake, we also need to ensure that there's a political liability and failure to show that courage. Which brings me full circle to resilience in unexpected places. In the end, our response should look like solid urban development, which Judy noted. It turns out that healthy, socially cohesive, economically stable, culturally vibrant opportunity-rich communities will be more resilient in the face of climate change and other disturbance. That is Kresge's aim and the work we support in New Orleans, Detroit, and other cities across the United States. But it also strikes me that this is exactly what Judy proposes to do through the Resilient Cities competition and what so many of you in this room are trying to do every day. So thank you for your work. Kresge is grateful to have such thoughtful and committed partners. Thanks very much.